to Super Bowl last night? Yeah. It's very, very exciting. Apparently, the San Francisco players are complaining today they didn't know the rules of overtime. So interesting. Well, it's my hope today to have sort of an interactive conversation. And I want to talk about some of the things that we're observing on the geopolitical landscape, trends, patterns, a little bit with a focus because a lot of the work that I do is in preparation for the upcoming U.S. presidential elections, but I think the world today does have a lot of conflict that is impacting all of us in various different ways. So applicable, but I think the background lens of it, for me at least, is a little bit the elections, but I think the lessons learned can be taken to other things. I would describe the world today as really being impacted in cybersecurity by three things. The first is COVID, right? It has really continued to change the way that we interact, hybrid workforces and so forth. Conflicts all around the world, starting with Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, all over, and then coercive activities by governments causing conflict on the World Wide Web. A lot of time, are you able to throw my... Okay, great. Sometimes when I'm going to be sharing some data today or some of my insights, I just want to preface it that a lot of this is coming from the Cloudflare network, which is geographically dispersed across 300 countries. We have over almost 13,000 networks directly collecting into us, hundreds of terabytes of data, at the edge, very fast connectivity. And so some of these insights just are coming from that as sort of background. Of course, we don't see everything. So who is familiar with last week, this news article that came out about deep fakes in the U.S. New Hampshire primaries? Anyone familiar? And by show of hands, how many people are worried about things like deep fakes impacting financial institutions or their businesses, this type of thing? Like, anyone, would you like to share what your fear is or concern?
I think the fear is the trust that's not already in place today gets further deteriorated by the fact that there is deep fakes or augmented scripts or videos that would counter the organization's internal climate that we already have. So the insider threat risk plus deep fakes will just augment and amplify that threat further.
Makes sense, yeah. Peter? Same. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead, yeah. Please, yeah. Please, yeah.
My concern is affecting the stock market and the financials of the organization. There are deepfakes that are coming out and then advising or advertising something, and by the time that you want to react to that, even if it takes a couple of hours to react to it, the damage potentially is already done, and people, they could have financial gain or financial losses substantial until the effect of it is actually mitigated.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead, sir, yeah.
So representing CISO, I come up with a different profile is the impacts from threat nations, leveraging AI deepfakes to sow internal discord. We use it as foreign interference in domestic processes. This message speaks your statement there of those that already have their minds, it magnifies it. So the use by foreign nations to magnify discord or disconnect domestically weakens the nation, so they have to focus resources internally so that either offensively or defensively we have less resources dedicated externally.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I've been paying attention to these very closely. They're really fascinating. I mean, certainly you can get tricked by them. I'm going to make a claim that at least in the short term, this type of disinformation won't really create new attacks, but it will do what you were talking about, which is stretch, folks who are already susceptible or want to be in a camp about, the prime minister is Fidel Castro's son or something crazy, these things, they just get pushed further and further away. But we'll kind of get to it. I wanted to kind of start there, but as we go forward, just share a little bit more about the thinking I've been doing here. So, I mean, I started my career for the U.S. intelligence community as a ballistic missile analyst. And I share that because I think that one of the things we're seeing as these attacks evolve, particularly as in the geopolitical stage, is that cybersecurity or cyber attacks are not really like pressing a button where you might launch a missile or drop a nuke, from the sky. There's an incredible amount of research, development, testing, evaluation, concept, theming and so forth. And it reminds me a lot about how new weapon systems are developed, where you might want to bring something, but it kind of goes through this life cycle. And so in some of the examples I'm going to show you, I think we're starting to see some of the formation of these theories and these ideas. Now, these attacks are real and they're happening, but they haven't really been fully implemented into some of the largest challenges, and we'll kind of start from there. Does that make sense to everyone? How many people here spend time thinking about who might attack them or why they might do that? So the guy from CISO, obviously. Sorry, what's your name? Just don't have to call you the guy. Darren. Okay, so Darren is thinking a lot about that. How about you? Like, what are you doing to sort of think about like who's attacked you or why they might attack you? Oh, did you raise your hand or no?
So I work in critical infrastructure, and so I listen to a lot of people tell me that I don't need to be worried about nation states. They're on their radar.
Yeah.
And
I need to talk to them.
well, I'm already in
Does anyone
contact with my local CISO guy, so we're good.
Does anyone not spend time thinking about who might attack them or who might not attack them? I pulled this from a training that we do at Cloudflare, where we kind of talk with our team all the time about why would people want to attack us and what might they be going for. And we find that it's sort of fundamentally very important to understand these different things, to create strategies and tactics. Our goal on the security team is not to prevent there from being attacks. It's to prevent there from being damages, right? Like, we can't control people from attacking us, but we can, and we find that starting at this place can be very, very helpful. So I want to walk through some examples and highlight for you some wrinkles in them of what we see being most effective or most likely to happen in the geopolitical landscape. The first is phishing. I'll walk you through some of the changes in this space, but today, as you're aware, phishing is an attempt to get someone like you or me to take an action. We continue to find that in over 9 in 10 times when there is a damage, there's a phishing attack that is kind of the initial vector. The primary change here, and I'll go into more depth, is just moving through different channels and attack vectors through it. Software vulnerabilities continue to be rare on the 0 day, but have some hypermetric DDoS attacks examples we want to walk through with you, and then also on the supply chain from there. So when it comes to phishing, I think folks really know this, that really all these attacks, even the Biden ones that I started with, they really kind of get boiled down to one thing. It's sort of being authentic. That authenticity can often come in two shapes and sizes. The first is most attacks try to mimic the brands that we trust, or they try to mimic the people that we know and do business with, and that authenticity, is really what drives a lot of the high click rates and success for these. So here's just a list of, it's not surprising the top 50 brands on the internet end up being the top 50 most impersonated URLs. Nothing really has changed there. But what has changed over the last year to 18 months, and we see more of this, is what we call multi-channel phishing, right? So if you think about, there are stages in attacks, and folks are familiar with this through like the kill chain. There are vectors, so exploitation or supply chain or phishing vectors, but the channels, right? Email, web, text, social, instant message, Apple Vision Pro, right? All these, these are the channels, and it used to be that attackers and defenders were very protocol or channel focused. And we've really seen a large rise in proliferation in multi-channel type attacks, right? And so some folks might be familiar with this example. We've written extensively about it at Cloudflare, where our colleagues started to receive text messages. Those text messages, on the surface are not totally unusual. I mean, perhaps, this kind of thing that could happen. The URLs and the pages that people get redirected look pixel perfect, right? And so what you find here happening is starting through people's phones, kind of moving them to the web, right, and then moving to the desktops. Attackers trying to confuse both the defenses, the strategies, and the people by using these different channels. Ultimately, this is an example of one where we're very successful at stopping it, but very successful generally otherwise. Questions about this? So I want to highlight this kind of like ability to use a broad range of channels simultaneously has been very, very effective for attackers lately, and something that most organizations are not prepared to defend against because they're kind of thinking about, investing in email or investing in the WAF or investing in the firewall and so forth, and kind of picking at those holes. Any questions about that? Okay, cool. So I want to switch to sort of the second area of that we're paying a lot of attention to, and these are, the example I'm going to share with you is basically a 0-day in the HTTP2 protocol. We've written about this in the last 4 to 6 months, since August. Yeah, it's about 6 months, that's right. Is anyone not familiar with this, or are folks familiar? Is anyone familiar with it? Okay, a couple people. The result here are the largest distributed denial of service attacks, ever recorded, upwards of 200 million requests per second, and all sorts of really fascinating things. But essentially, if you're familiar with how HTTP works, right, you have this sort of like request response, and then the HTTP to upgrade, right, you can kind of send multiple responses. What the attackers are doing here is they're sending cancel requests through, and so simply just flooding the channel so you can never respond to it. And you can see on the chart, these at 201 million requests per second are upwards of 3 times larger than anything previously seen. Now, I really like to highlight this example, just to go back to my earlier point, because what we've sort of assessed about what's going on here is this combination of not only is the attack relatively interesting, right? It's not particularly like a huge breakthrough, I would say, but it takes advantage of that idea of RDT&E, or research, development, and testing and evaluation, that I was highlighting before, where the attackers really perhaps are less attacking our networks, but more so utilizing the vast amounts of compute in order to see what's possible, right? As sort of a precursor to something else. I'll pause there and see if folks have any questions about these attacks, if you're unfamiliar with them. Okay. Just to, I won't belabor it too much. So these types of hyper-volumetric DDoS attacks have never really been easier for folks to launch. We're continuing to see all sorts of new patterns in this space, and we're continuing to see it be very, very cheap for attackers and for groups to be kind of renting these out, these sort of bot-for-hire types of things, primarily focused on gaming, crypto, web hosting, cloud computing, and so forth, but with a lot of potential to go after things like in the critical infrastructure and so forth. But the volume of them is just really very, very high before. A couple of things about the automated traffic. Most people, when they're thinking about this, they are thinking it's automated. We're seeing less than a third of these attacks are from automated bots. And we're seeing a lot of human interaction in developing those and sending them out. And so I think, one of the things we like folks to understand is what does the shape of the data really look like? And we're seeing a lot of different nuanced classifications popping out. Some of this you can observe in our Radar platform. If you're not familiar with Radar at Cloudflare.com, we have a lot of good charting on sort of day-to-day internet layer 7 and below activity. Questions about this before? Okay. Okay, so as I mentioned, I think one of the things that we're seeing really different when we look back at Ukraine and at the Israel-Hamas conflict is that prior to these conflicts really escalating and going kinetic, there's a lot of discussion about they're going to be riddled with cyber attacks, but that has mostly not materialized actually at all. And I would postulate first that that's because cyber attacks are not a magic button that you can push. They take incredible amounts of planning, development, and that's why you're not really seeing them in specific conflicts. At the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we can see here some very specific decreases in traffic But those recover relatively quickly, right? As the Ukrainians and the Russians find alternative ways to stay online and to stay communicative, right? So we don't see this sort of like reduction or elimination of internet traffic. Lots of reasons people might understand or not understand why, but very interesting to see kind of how that works. And then it's very helpful to observe how really behaviors are changing through these conflicts, right? So the primary sort of behavior that we've observed is that as the conflict kind of moves on, mobile devices or being able to, not being fixed, positioned for a variety of reasons, really is now the primary method or an increasing method by which people are able to communicate and connect, towards the World Wide Web. Questions about that or thoughts? Okay. And then, of course, just to kind of round out, on the behavior side, we see in these conflicts the combination of, declines in traffic that are predictable related to kinetic responses, the movement to mobile, and then the increasing desire to be able to communicate relatively securely through VPNs or through other tunnels and blockouts that you might expect. Okay, cool. So just sort of lastly, and then happy to have discussion with folks, what we expect to see moving forward is that attacks in a geopolitical context will be primarily about one thing, and that one thing will be authenticity. From the fake Biden calls to the AI-generated images, the key for success will be trying to be authentic. DDoS attacks, right, will continue to sort of scale to higher levels, but will not be as automated as people expect. We'll continue to see on the phishing, the business email compromise component, and then increasingly more and more ransomware reliance for the attackers. Okay, so questions or thoughts or things that people, yes, sir.
So just a thought, you're saying that you didn't see these things realized. I think the DDoS attacks on the ports and other things were realized and they had some impact. Granted, it wasn't a significant impact, but they definitely had impact. The other thing is, do you think that part of the reason why you weren't seeing a lot of success in those types of attacks is because so many other organizations have been involved in shoring up Ukrainians' infrastructure and building in capabilities to where they were much more resistant than they had been previously, because we know that there was a very impactful attack based on when they first invaded Crimea. And so do you think that those are the real reasons why we're not seeing the kind of impact that we saw before that was being expected, is because of that shoring up the infrastructure and being much more resilient, and maybe Russia being a little surprised at how resilient Ukraine was?
I'm going to take it just like in two parts, right? So on the first, I think the point that I just want to stress to everyone is that when we look at some of these hyper-volumetric attacks, they certainly do have impact, right? But for sort of the novelty, of them, I think what we've observed and been most curious about is they really appear to be more testing, right? And that's probably the most scary component of it, is that they're not really trying to achieve anything, but see if these reset requests actually work. And so that's really just the thing we're highlighting, is that a lot of the attacks that we're seeing, we're starting to think that they're more proof of concept. And those proof of concepts are technical proof of concepts, but they also give us a sense of maybe like limitations in our own technology, but mostly limitations in our imagination for things. Like someone will come along and figure out a better way to do it than to just like brute force, jam the internet with like hundreds of millions of requests. Does that make sense? So as we're seeing things and as we read reporting, as things pop up in the news, we're cautious about how many of these are more exemplar of what is to come versus like what will be coming and causing direct impact. And we still think that's pretty far away. So that's sort of like the first point. On the Ukraine thing, yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, what you said. And certainly these charts are from the very beginning, of the conflict, just to give some sense. But the point that I'm just trying to make is that there is a lot of hype and concern when conflict goes kinetic, that there's going to be this like magical sort of a cyber preemption. And I think in addition to the hard work that folks are putting into their networks, especially coalition work and so forth, what you're seeing is that it's very hard for countries to affect the kinds of outcomes that they want without tremendous amounts of preparation. And so I'm not doing it successfully, perhaps, but those two concepts are really more tied together than people are giving credit, that there's like this testing thing going on, and we see the hypervolemic DDoS, and then you're kind of like not seeing a lot of impact, as things go kinetic. Did that help?
To build upon that, I think one of the things that's often overlooked, and I love what you're talking about, the preliminary sort of like proof of concepts and then the delineation of an actual kinetic cyber attack. If we take, for example, state actors, when we're talking about geopolitical, you're typically going to be dealing with either the state actors or the state-aligned threat actors working in conjunction with them. It's strategic, and one of the things that often is hard to discover and we don't necessarily see in the data is pre-staging efforts. So when you're dealing with geopolitics, it's not about on and off and like proof of concept. There's a hidden middle part. So the Volt Typhoon is a classic example. You got PRC threat actors who have proliferated access and are sitting there in a pre-stage attack mode. So they are trying to gain access and capability so that when the decision maker makes that determination of the geopolitical, then you're going to see the kinetics. So just because you don't see kinetics, it's not just proof of concept and trial, there's also that hidden middle ground that we need to really be cognizant of, especially in our critical infrastructure providers, is where they can sit pre-stage. Now, that's an example where they're not sitting on critical infrastructure infrastructure for pre-staging. The pre-staging is 1, 2, 3 steps removed in some sort of obscure area where you guys can't touch it. It's hiding in plain, easy access, waiting to be used kinetically. And that's the big fear that we're working on, trying to highlight, root out, and mitigate.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and thank you for, I think you said it a little more clearly than I did initially as well. When I worked at NSA, when we wanted to test new tools, we sometimes would use them against what we called throwaway targets, right? Like, because if we were concerned about like bricking the machine or like really getting caught, like, we wouldn't use it in the high impact scenario. And so as we started to see some of these things pop up more increasingly, it started to really resonate with a lot of the team that like, oh, this is really that kind of pre-planning thing. And I think one of the things that the industry, community, we've all not really done well is take a more holistic approach. We're very good at these large attacks or the attacks to our industry and so forth, but we are starting to see that there are a lot, and so I started with the kind of the size of our network. We're starting to see that there are a lot of attacks that look very interesting, but they're not targeting anyone specifically. And we think there's more to do there to get people prepared. So for like what you were describing on the Ukraine, and I think in the case of like U.S. Cyber Command and in the Thighvice partners, they had a lot of insights to the Russians, but these attacks are becoming much more easier for others to launch, as well. So thank you. Yeah. Any others? There you go. Oh, maybe just behind you. Yeah. It's just yeah.
Well, if you could talk about yes, go ahead and continue my phone.
Oh, okay.
Just a touch point is that the reduction in actual tactical warfare, you take on the Ukraine example or the Hamas-Israel conflict, is it because of the fear that cyber attacks will eventually lead to an actual implementation of physical warfare move like Israel did in Hamas's attack? They launched a cyber attack and they were faced by an actual missile strike on the actual location.
Sorry, just to repeat it back to you. Are you asking why do we think that they're
With the real fear that if there is an actual cyber attack launched by these threat actors, they will be faced with actual military response.
No, I don't think that that's it. I think that in these two particular scenarios where they're almost hurling in space towards going kinetic, right? There's no stopping it. It's like there's sort of two things happening. Like one, you're gonna bomb the thing anyways, so like why bother to like infiltrate the telecom network, right? You're just gonna blow it up. And then second is that when there's not enough planning and preparation to do it, just the timeline to go from concept to real capability is much more impractical. I think that's less so like obviously like in Israel, Hamas, or like India, Pakistan, where these countries are like always kind of at these throats. But I think as new conflicts, pop up, folks aren't as prepared for it. And that's kind of the idea. Sorry.
Touching on the topic of smishing as an attack vector.
Yeah.
In speaking with our social engineering vendors and also doing research on industry insights, what we've seen is that smishing attack is a higher risk when it comes to consumers, not as high as when it comes to staff. And when it comes to staff, it touches more on those, say, call center staff, staff with access to PII. Do you have any insights into that? And proves different of that, how large of an attack vector it is when it comes to organizations and their staff?
Yeah, I think that that's directionally correct, like from a statistical perspective. But I think in the example that we shared here, it's sort of like a mix. What really is plaguing enterprises and governments and small businesses particularly is this sort of like mix where the behavior on see the problem with the general smishing is that like nobody will text me for $1 million, right? And like if someone texts me, just be like, I mean the single greatest mistake I've ever made in my life was donating $10 to like a U.S. politician, because now I just get endless text messages, asking me for money, right? But I think it comes into this sort of authenticity component that I was speaking of. So most of the consumer-related, certainly from a volume perspective, they're more effective, just as a law of numbers, but the scenarios are less than ideal. And that's why we sort of share this example here, which is that like the scenario is much more attuned to an enterprise customer and to like user, and the impact is exponentially more damaging to get in through like the single sign-on and so forth. So I think in always when you're dealing with consumers and the switch to small or large enterprises, you're dealing with that sort of convergence of like what tips it over, for damage is either a volume or a severity into the place that you're getting into. Does that help? Anything else? Yeah, Peter.
When we see a merchant ship attacked, we send big warships.
Yeah.
So when we see attacks like that one, what is the position of Five Eyes or something like that behind the scenes? We have lived and breathed that space.
You mean for like the DDoS?
Whatever, like
Yeah.
these things hit us very hard. It hits our economy really hard. So where is the position of the Five Eyes? What are they going to do to help us?
Oh, to help like businesses? Yeah, I don't know entirely, but what I can say is that I think that at least in the United States, there have been more efforts in sort of public-private partnerships, which have been helpful. This attack here was heavily coordinated, not only between Cloudflare and the US government, but Google, Amazon, Akamai, many others. And I think that kind of coordination is allowing more discovery and then more responsible sort of like disclosure and fixing, from happening. My view is that the earlier we're able to identify these types of concepts, the more time we have to patch or to increase mitigations. And so it's less about the response than it is about getting in front, because I guess if my supposition would be that people are testing these things all the time. And the more testing that we know about, and just like the work I did in predicting ballistic missiles, then you would really know what's coming for you and would be ready for it, at that time. So it's not to say that there'd be a world without attacks, but there could be a world without damages, as a result. Does that help?
Can I help answer that quickly?
Oh, yeah, if you know, yeah, right, we have someone from the Canadian government, so yeah, go.
Just to follow up, I'll let you respond to it. Like, we must have now a better
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you so much. I'll hang, and thanks for exploring with me. Appreciate it.